Hi, I'm Shashank Bhargava, and you're listening to Three Things, the Indian Express news show. If you have been following the news, then you know that Sri Lanka right now is facing an unprecedented economic crisis. Except for Afghanistan, no other country in South Asia has ever experienced such a crisis in the past 75 years. Sri Lankans currently are facing crippling power cuts, scarcity of essential commodities including medicines, and are having to stand in long queues at fuel pumps because diesel is in extremely short supply. Now, this economic crisis has also led to a major political crisis with massive protests taking place in Sri Lanka's capital. Students, teachers, lawyers, doctors, and those from a whole range of other professions are all demanding that the president, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, should resign. One slogan that has become really popular among people is Gota, go home. Gota, go home! 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 Last week, Indian Express's national editor of strategic affairs, Nirupama Subramanian, was in Sri Lanka to see how the crisis was unfolding. Nirupama has been reporting on the country since the 90s and was based out of Sri Lanka from 1996 to 2002. In this episode, she joins us to talk about what has led to this crisis, what she saw on the ground, and the challenges that the present government faces. So, Nirupama, why don't you begin by telling us just the kind of shortages and problems people in Sri Lanka are facing right now because of this unprecedented economic crisis?
So the main thing here to remember is that Sri Lanka is a very import-based economy. Most of its essential items are imported. So this includes fuel, oil, most of the world imports that. But in Sri Lanka's case, it's also milk, pulses, lentils, some kind of fish that they don't have. Then many other things for daily use, even detergents, soaps, many of the things that they don't make. It's not really a manufacturing economy. Their economy is basically tourism and tea. They export tea and of course they want tourists to come all the time. So these are the two big things in their economy on which they're dependent. And the rest is all imported. All the goods are imported. So what happened was that they ran out of dollars to pay for these imports. That was sometime last year.
And I think because they ran out of dollars, they couldn't buy fuel. And because of that, they have been experiencing crippling power shortages, right? There have been a lot of power cuts in the country.
Yeah, exactly. So because many of the power plants are thermal-fired plants, so they need the diesel to actually start them up. So that led to huge power cuts, 13 hours at a time now at this point. Of course, long queues at petrol pumps for petrol or diesel. And the other thing that happened was that because they had no foreign exchange, the president announced last year that they would stop importing chemical fertilizers and the whole agriculture in the country would switch to organic fertilizers.
And the way this decision was promoted was that they said that this was going to be some kind of a green revolution.
Yeah, he was saying that Sri Lanka will be the first country to go entirely organic. Now farmers started screaming because farmers know better than anyone else that you can't change from one thing to another just overnight. So it was a bit like our demonetization that overnight this change happened. The paddy crop, now the yield is much lower than it has been at other times. And because for organic farming, you have to prepare the soil. The soil has to be cleansed over almost a year of the chemicals and only then the organic fertilizers work. All this has happened, so they now have a rice shortage also. So these are the things that are in short supply. There is also hyperinflation. So people who have the money can buy some of these items that are available, that limited imports that are coming in or earlier stocks, they can buy with that money. But even they are feeling the pinch because it's not unrestricted supply. You can't go and buy like 5 or 10 kilos of milk powder because the shopkeeper has to service other customers also, so they restrict those supplies. And people who can't afford it, those are the queues you see outside groceries because these are government-run grocery fair price shops, a bit like our ration shops, but it's not ration, which is available at a particular time of the month it is not like that. It's an always open grocery. And there, because the rice is still sold at the old prices, people queue up for that. So those are the queues outside groceries that you see.
So even though things haven't gotten to a point where it has led to starvation, we are still seeing long queues for essential items. And one thing we haven't even talked about so far is medicines. Those are in pretty short supply as well, right?
Completely. Medicines are another big emergency, actually, because I can tell you that when I went from here, friends asked me to bring some medicines like paracetamol. The main paracetamol is a brand called Panadol, and that was simply not there in the market. So people asked me to get some kind of paracetamol for them, which I took from here. But other things, I mean, you can, for a price, the hotels are open, the restaurants are open, the bars are open, people are there in those places eating. You can get a pizza with nice cheese and everything on it, imported cheese, because they don't really make their own cheese. And then you can order noodles, you can order pasta. So that's a parallel thing, and that happens, I guess, even when there is a short supply. There are people who have money who can go to these places, these restaurants, and they can order and they can eat and they can lead their lives as they would normally. But everybody knows that the economy is in free fall, as it were, and these are artificial. I mean, even if they are in a restaurant and eating, it's an artificial bubble. I think people are very aware of that, because for the first time, even in Colombo, people are feeling the power cuts, the fuel shortages, the diesel shortages. I mean, it's not just that you don't have diesel or you don't have petrol. It has disrupted livelihoods. It has led to an increase in the prices of goods that are available in Sri Lanka, like vegetables. So vegetables are available, but they cost the earth because they have to be transported from A to B, and that requires diesel. Cabs, Uber is there, but cabs are scarce because there's no petrol. There's a huge petrol shortage. So these are the daily things. I mean, so many gigs are dependent upon vehicles now, and those are all out of service because there's restricted supply of these two things.
Okay, so when did this economic crisis start? I mean, many believe that this is an old problem and it has been going on for a number of years. But when did this situation take its current turn? Like, one thing you mentioned was Sri Lanka's demonetization moment, the Gotabaya government suddenly deciding to switch to organic fertilizers. So that, I imagine, was one thing. What are the other reasons?
So that was really a consequence of the crisis. What really perhaps triggered it, I mean, if there is one moment to say that, if you're looking for that precise trigger, then it was probably immediately after President Gotabaya Rajapaksa's election in 2019. During the election, he had promised that he will cut taxes, he will abolish certain other taxes, which he immediately did upon being elected. So VAT came down from 15% to 8%. He abolished capital gains tax. I think there were 7 varieties of taxes that he either got rid of or reduced. Immediately what happened was that the government's revenues fell dramatically.
Right, because you do need taxes. The government runs on taxes.
Correct. So the minute the revenues came down, the international ratings agencies, they downgraded Sri Lanka, and Sri Lanka's ability to borrow then was affected, because earlier it had been borrowing from the market, from the international capital market. So it's much of its external debt, contrary to widespread belief that it owes, I mean, the maximum debts are with China. That's not really the case. China is just 10% of its external debt it owes to China. And Japan also, it owes 10% of its external debt is to Japan. But the maximum, about 40%, is to the international capital markets. So, when this revenue fell and it became very clear to international agencies what's going on, they downgraded, and Sri Lanka's ability to borrow from the international market also ended. So it started digging into its own reserves. And now when you're clearly living beyond your means, then the pandemic hit in March and the tourists stopped coming. And when the tourists stopped coming, then of course it became unsustainable.
Right, because you mentioned that the two big things that Sri Lanka earns money from is tourism and tea.
Tourism, tea, and remittances also of workers living abroad. I mean, if you're thinking in terms of foreign exchange, these are the 3 big foreign exchange earners. And then during the COVID, all those people also came back because jobs were cut, and majority of them, like in everywhere in South Asia, are low income earners. They go to work in low end jobs, house helps, carpenters, masons, that kind of job. So those got cut and they all came back. So that remittance also dramatically reduced. So this was the origin of the crisis.
And when talking about tourism, how much did the Easter bombings, the series of bomb blasts that took place in Colombo in 2019, how much has that contributed to the current problem? Because we know that the bombings had affected tourism as well.
Yeah, actually now that you say that, we are talking exactly on the third anniversary of that Easter bombing. And in 2019 itself, as soon as the Easter bombings happened, the tourism business nosedived. And so it was already a struggling thing, right? And then in 20, the pandemic really finished whatever was left of it. So just before the second wave, they had a good season, I think. And then there was a second wave. And then after that, again, it picked up. So what I'm hearing is that they already on the path to recovery on the tourism sector. And when all this suddenly hit the roof, the shortages and everything.
Okay, so one thing is COVID, which every country in the world had to deal with. But a lot of the crisis that we are seeing right now appears to be because of the mismanagement and the policies of the government. And there seems to be genuine anger in people against the Gotabaya government. How do we see that anger manifested on the ground?
So that anger is very clear on the streets. People have come out. I've never seen something like this in all the years that I've been following Sri Lanka. I used to be based there during the years that the government was waging this. The government and the LTT were locked in a huge war. I've never seen this kind of protest. Even then, the economy used to struggle at times, but this kind of a shortage, they have probably the nearest they have come to experience this was in the 70s. But those were the shortages people remember as being comparable. But even those were not as crippling as ones that they are facing now, and therefore the anger. Now, the anger started with the farmers saying our crops are going to be destroyed by this whole organic fertilizer experiment. But farmers' voices, as we know, unless they take to the streets as they did in India, they don't come out really. But what has happened in the last 3 months is that the Colombo folk have started feeling the pinch badly.
So from the rural areas, the anger has now spread to the urban parts.
Actually, the biggest protest we are seeing right now is in Colombo. There are not so many protests outside. There's great discontent. There's much insecurity about the future across the country. But the protests are really in Colombo. And for the first time, middle-class Colombo, wealthy Colombo, professionals in Colombo, lawyers, teachers, doctors, these are people who would not normally see on the road protesting like this. But they're all out there. And the target of their ire, naturally, is the President Gotabaya Rajapaksa. And of course, there's a feeling that the entire family, the Prime Minister is Gotabaya's elder brother, Mahinda Rajapaksa, who used to be president before. He was president for 10 years between 2005 and 2015. And now he's the Prime Minister. And then there are many other family members in the government. So there's a feeling that we are suffering, and they are very clear in their minds that these people have made money out of mismanaging the economy. That they are well off, they are wealthy, they have the flash lifestyles. In fact, Namal Rajapaksa, who's the Prime Minister's son, went off in the middle of these protests to the Maldives, and the hotel put it up to advertise their own property, saying Namal Rajapaksa, he was water skiing, and they had a photo and all that. That really got people.
Wait, so while Sri Lanka is facing a crippling economic crisis, you have the Prime Minister's son who is water skiing in Maldives.
Yeah, exactly. So all this really boiled people's blood over, and they're out on the streets, and everybody is saying they have to go first. We'll be able to solve our problems only if this family quits all its positions in government, all the positions that are with the family members in the government. They have to leave. And only then we can start solving the other problem.
And I suppose this is a bit surprising, right? Because up until a few months ago, the Rajapaksa family was actually pretty popular with the people, right? Like people were pretty happy with them.
Yeah, people are happy with them because people are especially happy with both Mahinda Rajapaksa and his brother Gotabaya Rajapaksa, because in 2009, when Mahinda was the president, Gotabaya was the defense secretary. And he is widely credited as the architect of the defeat, or let's say as the architect of the military campaign against the Tamil Tigers, which was successful and the LTT was defeated, and both brothers took credit for having defeated terrorism and securing the country, as it were, from this terrorist group that was operating in the north and killing people in the south with its suicide bombers and all that. This generation of protesters that's out there knows nothing. It has come of age at a time when Sri Lanka has known complete peace. There isn't that kind of fear that used to prevail in an earlier time.
So this idea that they got rid of terrorism from the country is what ran in their favor, basically.
Yeah, so they have actually dined out on this. They have projected themselves as the saviors of the country, and then very quickly it turned into the saviors of the Sinhalese Buddhist majority. So immediately after the war, which ended in 2009, you saw this resurgence of Sinhalese Buddhist majoritarianism, this triumphalism in the majority community, this thing that, we have defeated not just the LTT, but also the Tamil community, that now we have kind of shown them their place. So this was the widespread kind of feeling at that time, and they have made good of this to win elections and so on.
And now the Sinhalese Buddhists, the majority population in the country, are now also part of the protests against this government. But with this kind of anger, with people protesting, what kind of challenge does the Gotabaya Rajapaksa government face politically?
So politically, still there is a degree of uncertainty. Immediately after the first big incidents of these protests were on March 31st. Okay, that is when some people tried to break into Gotabaya's residence, private residence, not his official residence. It's in a suburb of Colombo, and he had never felt unsafe or insecure there before because he was so well loved by the people, or so he believed, that he would never be harmed like that. So he was to live there often, and I don't know whether he was there on that particular day or not, but on March 31st, like about hundreds of people, maybe 1,000 people or so were in that march, and then they tried to break through the barricades, and police had to resort to tear gassing and water cannons, and some buses and all other vehicles belonging to the police were set on fire. So this was a big reality check for the entire house of Rajapaksas, because it was scary, I guess. And then he, of course, immediately called an emergency and put a curfew and all that, but better sense prevailed and he pulled back all that because people were defying. Because in a previous time, curfew meant a curfew. Nobody would step out because, you could be shot off the streets immediately. But this time, people said, to hell with the curfew. And they took out marches during the curfew. And I wasn't there on that particular day, but somebody who witnessed it said it was, for me, unprecedented that somebody will break a curfew. Like, he's an older person. He's, I think, in his 60s, and he has seen the worst of times earlier as well. And he said it's unbelievable that people were marching on the street, completely defying, saying, come and arrest me if you want, but I am going to march on these streets.
Okay, so this is what has happened on the streets with people. What has happened in the parliament so far?
So what happened was, basically there was a moment when, of course, in parliament, they had a 2/3 majority because Mahinda just swept the elections. But what happened after these protests was a group of parliamentarians, 42 of them, they withdrew from the coalition and they said they're going to sit separately in parliament. Then there are some others within that ruling alliance who are also unhappy with the Rajapaksas, and they also indicated that they may not be with it. But even the withdrawal of these 42 people rendered their majority in parliament a bit shaky. Now, there are claims on either side that we still have the majority, and opposition saying, no, you don't have the majority. The fact is, what has happened is no one has gone out and tested this. The opposition has not yet challenged the government to a floor test, whether through a no confidence motion or whatever. Instead, what has happened is the government has seen that the diffidence in the opposition ranks, because no one has actually emerged as a challenger to Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa in Parliament. So there is a feeling that we can still possibly manage the situation. Among the Rajapaksas, this is a feeling.
Right, and when Rajapaksa's majority became unsure, they even asked all ministers to hand in their resignations, and they said that they will appoint a new government. And they even invited the opposition to form a new government, but the opposition, of course, said that they don't want to be a part of this. In fact, you write that one of the main opposition leaders, this man called Sajit Premadasa, he said that they should instead abolish the executive presidency. Sri Lanka, of course, has a kind of presidential system in which the executive power is exercised by the president on the advice of the prime minister. And Premadasa says that they should get rid of that. Why does he want that?
So the executive presidency in Sri Lanka is very, very strong. The president who got it in, who made this, who oversaw the transition from prime ministerial form of government to the presidential form of government was J.R. Jayawardene. And he famously joked, I don't know, it may be an apocryphal story, but it said that he used to boast that with this constitution, a president can do anything except change a man into a woman and a woman into a man. Everything else is possible for a president with this constitution. So now it gives so much powers. That's also another reason why no one wants to form an interim government with Gotabaya still as executive president.
Right, because no matter what they do, Gotabaya in his position as the president can just change that.
Yeah, he can still change that. If Prime Minister is Mahinda Rajapaksa and the brother is the president, if the finance minister, say from the opposition, takes a particular decision, Prime Minister and President can join hands and they can sack the finance minister also. So that is another reason why national government is not such a hot attraction for anybody. But Sajit Premadasa believes that if you abolish the executive presidency, half the problems in this country will resolve themselves on their own, and perhaps they will. And he has made a big pitch for it. But the problem is that it's a very long game.
Yeah, it would require significant amendments in the constitution, right?
Yeah, there has to be amendments to the constitution. It needs a 2/3 in parliament. Now, even for the no confidence motion, which they have been discussing, which is a simple majority, they're wondering if they have a simple majority or not. But 2/3 in parliament, even if it's passed by parliament, it has to be approved in a referendum. So this is a very, very long process, and many people have tried it before. I mean, many people have at least promised it before, but have never kept their promise, because once they become president, then they see, oh, wow.
Yeah, because then they also enjoy the same powers and privilege.
Yeah, they don't want to change it. So there is an impasse, meaning the Rajapaksas have not yet been able to appoint a full cabinet. They've been asking people to come up and take charge. But I think every minister, every person who was in the cabinet before, and everybody who's being approached by the Rajapaksas are feeling the heat of the protests outside. And they don't want to be compromised or tainted by accepting a position now. So everybody's waiting and watching.
Okay, so you have the Rajapaksas who have immense power because of the presidential system. And even though they have a wafer-thin majority, they don't have a major challenger who can strongly oppose them. And then you have a large population of the country who want them to go, but obviously they're not doing that. And you spoke to protesters, and I'm sure because of all these factors, they must be so uncertain about the future, right?
Yeah. So nobody knows what next. And even in the opposition, no one knows what next. So even for the opposition, whatever glue it is that can bring them together is, if tomorrow we bring a no confidence motion against Prime Minister Rajapaksa, what is the next step? What after that? Who will form the government? What kind of government will it be? Who will head it? Those are the questions that they have not been able to resolve. Monday, April 19th, is when the parliament meets again. So maybe something will emerge from that session.
Okay, so now let's come to the India part of this story. India has extended help to Sri Lanka. It has given the country rice and fuel, both diesel and petrol. How much relief has that been to the country?
So it has eased the shortages, but it's limited quantities, right? I mean, it's 500 million credit line for fuel. So you have seen diesel coming in from India, and it has eased the shortages a bit. And then there is another credit line of $1 billion for food and medicines. So Indian rice has started coming in. And April 14th, it was a new year both for Sinhalese and for Tamils. So they were able to release some supplies of rice into the market. So the shortages were kind of mitigated a bit. So this is the extent. And India is supposed to be considering another 2 billion in some form or the other. It may not be a credit line. It may be something in some other form. But they are supposed to be considering this request from Sri Lanka for another 2 billion.
And Nirupama, one of the things that you write is that Sri Lankans, they sort of have a mixed reaction to this assistance by India, right?
Yeah. So one of the very first things that I heard when I landed in Sri Lanka and went to a protest site was somebody just asked me, "Are you Indian?" So I said, yes. He said, "I have a message for India. Tell your government not to help the Rajapaksas. They must stand with the people. They must not stand with Rajapaksas." So I asked him, "Why do you say that?" He was not able to explain it to me immediately, but I spoke to some other people later on and they said there's a sentiment, there's an undercurrent in which this food help and the diesel help and the fuel help that we have been extending. People think, okay, the shortages will be mitigated by that, and then people's anger will come down, the temperature on the streets will come down, and the Rajapaksas will use it to their advantage. They will take the credit of that. So this I heard even as late as 2 days ago when somebody said, your government is giving 2 billion more to the Rajapaksas. So I said, it's not for the Rajapaksas, it's for the people of the country. They said, yeah, thanks a lot. But what is going to happen is that they are going to take the credit of that. So there is a very strong undercurrent in this whole thing that India is probably trying to save the situation for the Rajapaksas. So the Indian High Commission, whenever it speaks on these issues, they emphasize very strongly that it is a humanitarian assistance that they are extending. It is for the people of the country. It is to mitigate the suffering of the people. The other rumor that came up, and that also was denied very emphatically, they had to actually deny it more than once, the Indian High Commission, is that the Indian Army had landed in Sri Lanka and they were going to help secure the Rajapaksa family. And again, this had to be refuted very strongly by the Indian High Commission, because I don't think there is any such thing, and India would not be so adventurous as to send some soldiers to another country. Done this in the past, and they did this in the Maldives once to secure Gayoom against a coup attempt, but that was different. Those were different circumstances.
Okay, so finally, is there any next big thing or an event that will decide how this crisis will unfold?
So now there's fear that they might actually crack down on the protesters, maybe try to drive them away, maybe call them for talks. I think Mahinda Rajapaksa said, come and talk to me. And they said, no, first you go and then we will talk to you. So there's all that also. I think things are a bit up in the air right now. We'll have to see. I think the next big thing really in this week will be what happens at the IMF. And of course, Sri Lanka is reaching out to various countries for bridge financing. They reckon for the next 6 to 9 months, they'll need about $3 to $4 billion to meet the import bills. So they'll be looking for that. The government is hoping to tire out the protesters, that they will go home. How long can they stand here and shout? Maybe the energy will dissipate and they'll go home. So that is one line of thinking, that do nothing, let them all just let it fizzle out. And they also declared all of last week a holiday. They said it's New Year. And so between 2 weekends, all days were declared official holidays by the government, thinking that people will stay at home. But actually it worked in the opposite way. A lot of people just congregated at Golface, which is the site of the protests. And the numbers are now huge. So it's growing in many ways, and we just have to see how this is resolved. But a lot of people thought regime change is imminent. That has not happened yet. And for the protesters, that is a big disappointment that, they didn't run away.
You were listening to 3 Things by the Indian Express. Today's show was written and produced by me, Shashank Bhargava, and was edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar. If you like the show, then do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also recommend the show to someone you think will like it, share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can tweet us at Express Podcasts and write to us at podcasts@indianexpress.com.